Hello, we'll start. Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the digital conversations hosted by the Quest Social Legal Review. Today, we are going to be looking at the internet shutdowns in Jammu and Kashmir and the idea of right to internet and the state of journalism in the region. I am Aditya, and joining us today to discuss on this topic is distinguished journalist Anuradha Basin. She is the executive editor of Kashmir Times. Ma'am, I think students of law will not need a formal introduction about you because most of us have read about you and read your articles, and most importantly, your contribution to free speech and press freedom in the case of Anuradha Bhasin versus Union of India. But for our audience who are not from a law background, I'll introduce her as one of most eminent journalists, one of the biggest names in journalism in India, and to be very frank, at a stage where India ranks 142 on the Global Press Freedom Index, she was courageous enough to knock the doors of Supreme Court to fight for democratic rights against undemocratic practices. She's one of the fearless journalists of this era, and we're extremely delighted to host you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words.
So, ma'am, as the theme revolves around internet shutdowns and right to internet, we will address the elephant in the room and we'll ask you about your case. Could you please share your journey with the case and why did you decide to file a petition in the Supreme Court?
Look, I went to the court at a time when Kashmir went into an unprecedented freeze. I mean, I've been working for 30 years as a journalist, and my career, incidentally, has coincided with the armed insurgency. The year that started, I started working as a journalist. So I've seen several phases of how the press was facing different kinds of intimidations and pressures, not only from the non-state actors but also the state actors. And we've been through all of that, and we've been through bans, we've been through the journalists have been killed, many have been intimidated in various ways. There was financial choking of newspapers because there was a complete reliance on the government ads, including ours. Since 2010, we haven't been getting the DAVP ads. But despite that fight in some ways has been going on. This We'd faced internet bans earlier, but never so stringent, in the sense that this was absolutely blanket uh, ban on communication across the valley, including not just the internet, but also the mobile phones and the landline phones. So you cannot hear a thing. Absolute silence amidst restrictions, the barbed wires, and I was not in touch with anybody, not even my own reporters, my own staffers whose well being I didn't know of. I didn't know of what was happening in the hill districts of Jammu region, Rajouri, Punch, Doda, which were facing similar curbs. Only in Jammu, the internet ban was partial. And Jammu is usually not a place where you really get, you have the happening stories taking place. When a major change has happened, a major political, historic, geographical change, you expect some kind of a reflexive action or response in Kashmir. So there is this whole yearning to know what is happening, a curiosity as a journalist. And as a journalist, also, it was a call to duty, because a journalist's job is to inform the public. It is to bring out the stories of the people. It is not just to reflect the voice of the officials of the state, which was the only voice, the only narrative that we were getting. Our job is also to hunt for the counter narrative and bring all the pieces together. And this was, how could I talk about it when I didn't know myself? The next day, there were teams from Delhi going and all that, and we were getting information secondhand, which we started kind of using as sources and using these in Jammu. Our Srinagar edition was not being printed. Our Jammu edition was being printed, but there wasn't much news. I mean, earlier we used to have exclusive news about Kashmir and all. And this is what compelled me. And I realized, I said, something like this that happens, it's so historic that this is going to be a long haul. And if I'm not able to do my duty, I had two choices. Either I just surrender and play along, or I fight back. So I chose the latter.
Ma'am, while we were researching about the judgment, do you feel that this judgment was sufficient enough? Because, yeah,
When you look at the judgment, there's also need to review it in the backdrop of how the Supreme Court I think I'll repeat. When you look at the judgment, you need to also review it in the backdrop of how the judiciary overall is conducting itself, particularly in the last 1 year or so. And in that sense, I think it was pretty much significant because if you look at many other cases where the judiciary has really not come to the rescue when it comes to matters of fundamental rights, of civil liberties, of constitutional freedoms of individuals, of people. And in that sense, it was significant because even though it did not uphold in the verdict that access to internet is a fundamental right, it made those observations and only used a technicality that this was never asked. And so the court is agreeing that this is a fundamental right, it is inviolable. The other thing that the court did was to say that the state cannot impose restrictions. And then, since my petition and many other petitions related to different restrictions, including Section 144, were clubbed together. So the court was actually talking about all these restrictions and saying that the state cannot go in for prolonged restrictions, cannot impose prolonged restrictions on people, and that included both internet and Section 144. And if restrictions have to be imposed for a limited period, then it has to bring out in the public domain the orders and the reasoning why it is doing so and what exactly it is doing. As it is, but what the court did not do was to declare that, to restore the internet, to say that internet needs to be restored immediately. By the time that the court verdict came, it was already 5 months. I had filed the petition on August 10th. The verdict came exactly 5 months later on January 10. So 5 months to decide a fundamental right. I think anybody can judge what this really means. And within those 5 months, by then, many of the other restrictions had been eased. The landlines were back, and by October, mid-October, I think the mobile phones also, the postpaid mobile phones were working. The prepaid mobile started much, much later after the verdict. And so then the court also said that, while it said that there cannot be prolonged restrictions, there was an ambiguity on what prolonged period means. Does it mean a week, as the court said that the orders need to be put up by the government within within a matter of 7 days? Does it really mean 7 days? It hasn't specified. Does it mean over a year? Because we still have those restrictions in place. So what is an acceptable prolonged period? The most significant thing about the judgment is that while the internet access to internet freedom has been accepted as an inviolable right under Article 19, and the court was also talking about the doctrine of proportionality. But these all remain very ambiguous, and at the end of the day, how is it eventually translated? Because the court asked the government, which has taken away the internet freedoms of the people, to review the matter. So the government takes its own sweet time. It took another 2 weeks to start acting. The first order was out in phases, like charity. Internet access started being restored, starting with the broadband internet, and just 100 whitelisted sites. There were massive firewalls. And first there were weekly orders, then there were about fortnightly orders, something which continues till date. By beginning of March, I think the first week of March, we had 1,000 whitelisted sites, and subsequently the next fortnight we had the firewalls were thankfully removed. By end of March, when Kashmir transitioned from one lockdown to another, the COVID-related lockdown, the mobile internet was restored, but only 2G internet, not 4G service. Across Jammu and Kashmir, today we have only 2G mobile internet, and it's important to point out that in a country like India, majority subscribers of internet rely on the mobile internet, not on the broadband facility. So that has been extremely challenging. In the last 5, 6, this all started in around ending January, February, so about 7 months or so. We've had about, I think, 17 or 20 such orders that are periodically made after every few weeks, where the review is being done. And other than that, the situation is such that internet freedom, we've realized, is something, it should have been a fundamental right. And in a place like Kashmir, it seems that fundamental rights are not permanent. It's the other way around. The fundamental rights have become temporary and restrictions have become permanent, because it can be taken away anytime. Now, with the kind of ambiguity that the court left, so the government is circumventing around the spirit of the judgment, and circumventing it and interpreting it in its own way. So every time any incident happens, it becomes an excuse to take away the internet. For at least twice, for a period of 3 to 6 days, there was a complete internet ban in the valley again in April and May, and which also included mobile phones. Again, there were no more, only one, I think BSNL phones were working, and rest of the phones were not working. And off and on, in certain pockets, internet is being banned. So there have been 70 such bans in the last 5, 6 months.
Ma'am, as you just mentioned about how this ambiguity in the judgment is leading to negative repercussions which are detrimental to development of Kashmir and freedom of press and freedom of speech there, do you feel that this ambiguity may also result in government interpreting internet shutdowns as a norm, and it can become a as a part of public policy in the region in near future? Do you feel there is a chance of things going around this way?
It's not just that I fear that it will become a public policy, and there are other compelling reasons as well. It's not just taking away the internet, it's also the way things have happened preceding August 5th, the reorganization of the state, and the changes, the alterations in the political and the geographical landscape. But also what has happened before and after that. There are certain steps that have created, which have created a realm of fear overall, and also within the media, particularly the media. And media is something which is extremely important because it is connected to every sphere of life. It's going to talk about them, it's going to document what is happening, it is going to provide information. So if there is no information, you really want to know what is happening, say for instance in the field of in health sector, in education sector, in business sector, in politics, etc., 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 and so on and so forth. So, these are things which I say it's worrying, because is it using it as a policy in Kashmir? I'm afraid it might be, because we recently also had a media policy which just came up. There were, before August 5th, a lot of journalists had been picked up and rounded up, including a senior editor of two newspapers, and one leading newspaper in Kashmir Valley. They were picked up by NIA in some terror case and questioned for 3 days. So that is something that has created such immense fear that the media, the local media at least, has just completely surrendered. And then we had three criminal cases against three journalists over frivolous reasons, and reasons that have not been uh, is explained in the charges that have been made. There's one vague case about fake news. There are two journalists who are facing charges for their Facebook posts, and there's no specified post. It's just a general ambiguous thing again. So you keep guessing, what are you being held for? So you make a case and then you find a charge for these people, and then uh, these actions preceded a media policy which came out in June, according to which the information department officials in Jammu and Kashmir will be empowered to pinpoint what content in the media or in the social media is can be construed as fake news or can be construed as anti-national, and whether criminal charges should be pressed against these journalists. So they are going to decide, and naturally, when somebody in the government is going to decide, the criteria is going to be very different. It's not going to be decided on merit and on professional basis. There is no rules have been framed as yet, but the policy has been put out there, just to create that kind of deterrence, so that media doesn't write. And what I'm afraid of, this really does seem like a policy, as you say, it is the state using it as a policy. What I'm afraid of is that Kashmir is now becoming an experimental lab for rest of India, and that is extremely worrying. If you see the kind of the curtailment of civil liberties in Kashmir that has been happening in recent years, and you see similar templates being followed in many parts of India now today, and that might also be the case for Indian media. In the last 6 months of COVID, several journalists have faced, some form of persecution or the other. Many journalists have lost their jobs, and it's not just COVID related. There are also pressures which are political in nature. And therefore, not just the state. I'm afraid it would be a template for rest of the world as well. I mean, we seem to be surpassing even something like China, and we have a vibrant constitution. If we go by the constitution, it's completely unconstitutional. We have had a fairly vibrant democracy, and it's completely incompatible with that.
Ma'am, this is where I feel the petition which you filed will again come into play. I feel the judgment has in a long term is a win-win situation, but I feel coming to a short term, might have helped to revive hopes in the region. But don't you feel there is still a sense of delayed justice because of an absence of an immediate relief? Or do you feel the judiciary should do more when authoritarian powers come into play and take such actions? How do you
Yeah, of
balance?
course. Of course, did make a difference. Had I just sat back and said, okay, nobody is speaking, so let me also not stick my neck out and not, uh, risk any kind of backlash. Because the day I went to court, as I mentioned earlier, in 2010, the DAVP ads, which is the central government ads, were stopped for Kashmir Times. So the day I went to court, the state government ads were stopped. So there is a backlash. It's becoming extremely difficult for us to survive, but we are stubborn enough and we continue so far till we can. But I think on hindsight, I think I'm glad I went to the court, because at least what I got, I mean, even after 5 months, the partial easing of restrictions. Um, uh, would it have happened if there was nobody talking about it? I think one does need to struggle for one's rights. If they're going to be crushed by somebody, you're not going to get it in a platter.
Absolutely, ma'am. Ma'am, when we also talk about internet shutdowns, it is not just limited to freedom of press. It also has an impact on economy, on healthcare, on psychology, on education. So, eh, since 4th August 2019, how do you see this? What has been the economic impact of shutdowns on the region per se?
Economic impact has been immense. In the first 5 or 6 months, the business organizations in Kashmir Valley alone had calculated some 18,000 crore rupee losses. This probably did not include the horticulture sector. And horticulture is a mainstay of Kashmir, the apple industry and the pear industry and other dry fruits and all that. Um, and also, it did not include the losses in Jammu region, because Jammu was also impacted, if not equally, at least 50%. The economy of Jammu and Kashmir regions, despite their diversity, despite their animosity and their very different politics, is interdependent. And so any setback to economy in Kashmir is going to be a setback for Jammu as well. Any lockdown is going to impact Jammu's economy, because Jammu is basically a trader's hub, and it's supplying goods to rest of the valley. So that the pilgrimage was also, it just went on the back burner, and so all these things contributed to the poor economy of JNK overall. And recently there's a local human rights group, JNK Coalition of Civil Society, which came out with a certain figure saying, I think 178 billion rupees losses to economy in Kashmir Valley alone. So, you can add at least 30-40% in Jammu region itself. And the fear in Jammu is so much. Why we don't have any, statistic for Jammu? We've been trying in Jammu as journalists to get the different these traders bodies to speak about it, and they'll just say several hundred crores or 1,000 crores. They keep just giving you a very vague figure. But the fact is that there is so much fear of speaking out, even though they have not even faced a fraction of the repression that Kashmir has been facing, but also that Jammu has not had a history of that kind of repression. So that itself, there is so much of psychological fear itself. If you're talking about the psychological impact, psychologically, one, there is a psychological fear which impacts every sphere of life. And because of internet shutdown, and because every sphere of life is getting impacted, it's like a vicious circle. There is a psychological trauma that keeps increasing and adding up. uh, Education, take education for instance. I mean, for 1 year, students in Kashmir haven't gone to school. They went maybe on 24th or 25th of February, the schools opened after a long time. And then by mid March, because The COVID-related lockdown in J&K started a week earlier. We are always a special case, though we are fully integrated now. Still treated very special. So it came 1 week earlier. So maybe, I mean, students have gone to classes for 2 weeks, 3 weeks maximum. That's it. So that, what impact does it have on the children in the valley who have been put behind barbed wires, who have been completely cocooned in their houses with no internet? Today's age, and if you see, Kashmiris are very active on the social media, extremely active. They're very vocal. They are participating in a lot of discussions. They are using internet for a variety of things. Students are using it to learn. Students are using it to discuss things. It's being used for not just education. The artists are using it. A lot of stand-up comedians are using it. Musicians are using it. Cartoonists, everybody, business entrepreneurs. According to the report that I was mentioning, the JKCCS, it says about 500,000 people have lost jobs because of the internet ban, because of the digital ban, because they were so dependent on it. Many journalists couldn't file stories. Those who have those who are freelancing, especially in the rural areas. The only media facilitation center that we have, which was under complete surveillance, completely inadequate, with 3 computers for over 100 journalists who had to jostle for space and would get about 15 minutes, was only in Srinagar. There was no such facility in any of the districts. So even my own correspondent, I heard from him somewhere in December when he started coming down to Srinagar to file stories. And these were just 2 correspondents from South Kashmir. Others I didn't know of, whether they were fine, had they been picked up, where were they? I had no idea. But many of them went jobless. And there was one local news magazine which did a complete story of how they were coping up with their lives and getting alternate jobs. One of them was working at a construction site because there were no jobs available. So that was the condition. You can imagine the kind of psychological trauma that happens. Patients were unable to get access to healthcare facilities. There's a lockdown. There are no phones available. Somebody needs an ambulance. The cancer patients, those who are on dialysis, and diabetes patients, all these. And
So it's a follow-up question, ma'am, actually. When we talk about the entire idea behind imposing shutdown was it was called as an integration step by the government after reorganization of state and abrogation of Article 370. Do you feel this whole phase of internet shutdown and keeping this region in the darkness has also resulted in losing of public confidence and losing of faith in democracy and democratic principles?
look, first of all, I mean, when you take a step in the name of integrating people, in the name of giving equal rights to the people, bringing about some kind of parity, and saying this is all for the betterment of the people, maybe to end terrorism. I'm not even getting into that, the reasons that they were giving, but just the basic premise that this is something that will ensure people equal rights, the fundamental rights, and all that. The very first basic necessity of any democracy, according to our constitution, it's a participatory democracy. So you lock up these people and you say, okay, we are going to decide for you what is good for you. Are we not capable of deciding for ourselves that whether we wanted it or we didn't want it? That's our right to decide. So we were not even asked. We are kept in the dark. Suddenly one morning we get up, and of course there were a lot of rumors and all going on, but only in Kashmir. And we thought, probably Kashmir was going to be bombed, maybe there was going to be war on the borders. And one fine morning, based in as I am in Jammu, I get up in the morning and I find there's section 144 and a lot of restrictions on the road, almost curfew-like situation in many areas. And we get to know within a few hours that our future has been shaped. The other thing is that if you're doing it for equality for 1 year, the civil liberties in Kashmir are badly trampled. I mean, massive arrests that you've made. There is no space for democratic dissent. There is no space for freedom of speech. The media has been totally curbed, censored, without a declared censorship, and silenced. Are these equal rights?
Question which we need to introspect. Uh, Ma'am, coming back to the issue of how internet shutdown can take place, as you have mentioned about principles of proportionality and principles of necessity, which the court also mentioned. But do you feel in a region like Kashmir, there is a need for policymakers to think beyond these principles and go into people, gain their confidence before imposing this? Because it is sense that internet shutdowns are here to stay. It will be there maybe in the future, but we need to look beyond proportionality and effective and necessity and look for greater principles before you impose them.
No, definitely. And that's true of any region, not just Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir, particularly, because when we look at somehow in Indian national narrative, when we look at Kashmir, we usually view it from a very ultra nationalist perspective. We see it from an ultra nationalistic prism, and with a hypersensitivity with regards to the security and territorial security at that, while completely disregarding human security, which is equally important. And I think in an age it's the government of today that has coined the slogan of digital India. So if you're going to take away that digital India, first you connect everything digitally. Even like all your social welfare schemes, which went kaput in Kashmir because the digital space did not exist and people were deprived of their right. um, it just goes off. There's something wrong, you cannot take it away. So maybe, I mean, there has to be a minimal taking away of these freedoms. We do understand the concerns. There are security concerns, there are strategic concerns, but there are ways to address that. The government would need to gear up its own cyber security in a better way. The other thing is, if at all you have to take away these freedoms, which I don't think should happen. It should be rarest of rare. Is sometimes is also a very ambiguous thing, which ends up being used very often. But if you do, there should be a committee of experts. We are a participatory democracy, and participatory does not just mean voting every once in 5 years. It means you participate in every decision making process. So maybe people who are experts in related fields, they would need to be taken on board um, before taking such stringent decisions.
Ma'am, so do you feel this idea of making internet shutdown as a normal is also very much reflective in the global space as well? We are seeing internet shutdowns and virtual curfews being imposed across the globe by various countries. But democracies, we don't expect these kind of measures from democracies. Don't you think that in a functioning democracy like India, we have greater responsibility to ensure civil liberties? And how do you, as a journalist, how do you see this? Don't you think we should the state should there is a need for state to act more, give more liberties, and keeping in darkness is a violation of basic human rights?
Definitely, definitely. I think the more the state is gives space to uh, the people to express their opinions freely, the better it would be for the health of democracy, for the security of the country. The more it takes away the rights, it's going to face a backlash among the people. I don't think it works for the betterment of security either.
Okay, ma'am. Now we are very excited to hear about you from the state of journalism in Kashmir. So as so our idea of the state journalism in the region is from an outsider perspective, and considering the limited amount of information that is available, we have
Mhm.
researched that in rural parts of Kashmir, journalists are not able to go, and there is limited access to information in Srinagar. And although the information which is accessible to journalists are heavily surveillanced, and there is an atmosphere of pressure. So, considering this, I have two related questions. One, is this whole scenario true? Second, whether this atmosphere of pressure and surveillance is also affecting the content which comes out.
Yes, definitely. The confidence is getting impacted. The greater pressure is on the local media, those who are working for the local newspapers. The editors of the newspapers have completely become silent and they're unwilling to print anything. I face problems even with my own reporters sometimes, unwilling to do a story, especially if they're based in Kashmir, and I can understand those vulnerabilities. Um, but it's not that everybody's fallen silent. Journalists are going out. They're going out into the field and reporting and getting out stories. The problem is that uh, when you approach, say, somebody who has, it's not just about human rights violations, people who face torture and people who face detentions and who have been brutally brutalized physically, they are scared to speak.
Hmm.
It's also that, and they fear once they approach the media. There have been cases where if the stories have appeared in the media, there has been a backlash on them. So there have been cases like that. So there is a lot of fear of that, speaking out to the media. Even somebody like even normal things, even the traders organizations were unwilling to talk about a lot of things. They're only giving us statistics of the losses that have happened. There are other many other stories which they will talk off the record. Now there's so much of anonymity in the story that itself becomes a problem. The other major problem is that officials have become completely inaccessible. Whoever you try to contact, and I've talked to so many reporters, they say they're just completely inaccessible. We keep waiting for days. And according to that new media policy, if you're not going to get an official version, you're going to be charged under that fake news charges. So there is always this dilemma: do we do this story, do we not do this story? I myself faced that problem. I wanted to write about the media policy and the rules hadn't been framed, and so I was curious. I know, of course, the officials, since everything is coming from Delhi, I don't expect the bureaucrats to know the entire philosophy behind the policy, but I wanted to know how it is going to be implemented. What are the rules going to be framed, and which is there going to be a separate body to monitor all these charges, and how it is going to be done? And I wrote to several officers, including the principal secretary, and they just and waited for several days, 4 5 days. I waited. I phoned them, I messaged them, I WhatsApped them twice or thrice. I chased them on the Twitter account, and there was just no response, as if I don't exist. And I'm here. I put in 30 years of my work. So somebody who's a young journalist who's really out there in the field, I can well imagine what he's facing right now, he or she is facing right now.
And it is horrific to actually listen about this because Kashmiri Times, I feel, is the largest circulated newspaper English daily in the region with over 3.5 lakh
It was
uh,
at one
daily
point in
readers.
time, but it is the oldest newspaper. But I think our circulation started getting impacted because of a financial problem since 2010. And so now the last 1 year it's been badly hit. but at least we try to write and critique the government as much as we can, whereas many other no, not that I want to draw a comparison, but it's important to know that while even as the local media normalized its functioning, what has happened is that the content is missing. Some of the stories are back, but very mildly worded. The comment pages virtually disappeared for a long time. There were no editorials, and when the editorials and the comment articles came back, there was very little on the politics. There's a bit now being said about the mainstream politics, the local mainstream politics, but nothing to critique, Article 370 or its fallout, even talk about health issues, about how what people on a day-to-day basis. So that is missing, and that is extremely worrying, because media empowers the local people. It's an
Yeah,
important tool. It informs the people, it empowers the people, because it becomes their voice, especially when they are marginalized.
yeah. I'm in this phase of darkness. How do you manage credibility and objectivity of information that comes out? When you are saying that there are restrictions on how reporters can go to on the ground, or
Yeah.
there is difficulty to assess information, how do you maintain objectivity and credibility?
It's very difficult. There are always dilemmas. I mean, there would be dilemmas of the reporters. Somewhere the reporters are willing to take the risk, the editors are not. Somewhere it's vice
Yeah.
versa. But it is, I mean, we become more cautious. It's been becoming, as journalists, the job is extremely challenging, tiring, not just physically but also psychologically and mentally exhausting. You keep weighing each and every word. Not that we shouldn't be, we always were on the cautious side, but now you're extra cautious. Oh, can this word be misinterpreted? So
Mm, mm. Yeah. So, ma'am, as you head the Kashmir Times, what has been the holistic impact of this whole shutdown? Not just financially, I'm talking about circulation and also about editorials that come out. You said, as many of the editorials don't have content related to Kashmir. I happened to read an article in some of the article based in Kashmir region, which talked about issues in Madras per se. So, do you feel there is a disorientation in news that is coming out? People are not getting to read what they actually want due to this whole
mhm.
atmosphere of limited and misinformation and restricted information.
So that's improved now, but the first 3 4 months, I think that sadly was the situation. There was a page one which was mainly related to Kashmir, but nothing really about the main impact. Recently, like, I saw an article on how tourism has been impacted by COVID lockdown, and there's no mention of what happened 6 months before that. So. Um, how tourism has suffered in the last 1 year because of COVID lockdown, and there's no background giving. You're talking about other issues, but really not mentioning. I mean, health is about how to heal bones, about how to eat walnuts and apricots for better health. There is nothing which is very critical. You'll read about Cambodia, you'll read about other things, but occasionally now some articles have started appearing, but it really is very, very rare to find something that which the government will be uncomfortable with. And what is worrying is not just regimes. Sometimes states will try to take away people's power. That does happen, but it is for the media to fight out. It is for people, for civil society to fight back. And somewhere at the moment, at least, the media is pretty much silent. And I'm talking about the local media, but it's also because of the local media that we know of lot of things that happen. For instance, young men being picked up in crackdowns and raids, and how they were tortured and brutalized, and some of them, in which we verified later. I was there as part of a civil society group, and in a village that men in villages, they were being brutalized. Just one person being brutalized, and a psychological terror to subjugate people. That kind of mechanism was being used, because they would put a loudspeaker and beat him up so that his shrieks could be heard in rest of the village. So and these stories were true. People talked about it. um, but the sad thing is that so far there is very little voice that one can hear, the dissenting voice. If it's not being allowed,
Mm.
you have to get it back.
So when we talk about the suffering of media, there is much more than suffering of media personal, right? Like, for example, the basic idea for which they are working about. There have been several voices from from the region talking about newspapers becoming mere pamphlets of government advertisements, solely promoting what the government is doing, not focusing on what is happening at the ground level. Don't you feel there is a sense? Do you adhere to this view, or do you feel media is radically over the course of time is changing its nature?
I think we also need to look for, in terms of media, we need to look for new revenue models. If there's going to be so much of dependence on ads and government ads come at a price, you toe their line, you get your ads. You'll have a government policy saying it's a rationalized policy, and it'll be on the basis of circulation and whatever, and the the other formalities and all, but it never happens that way. It did, uh, and now more so. Look at our own case. We're not getting a single ad. I'm not getting the Kashmir papers because of this whole COVID lockdown. We're not getting the Srinagar papers here, and I haven't seen them. But some of my friends, journalist friends in Kashmir, were telling me that some of the papers there, if they were getting 700 centimeters of advertisements before August 5th, 2019, they're now getting 2000. So, well, I'm not sure if that is really true, but then it,
Uh,
it comes
ma'am,
at a price. And I think we need to look at different revenue models. We need, especially for the regional media, where, and regions like Jammu and Kashmir, where the corporate media has not made its presence felt. Not that the corporate ads also are, uh, they exact their own price at the end of the day.
so Kashmir has, since the very beginning, has been a very vibrant ecosystem in terms of knowledge. So, media being a
Yes.
very foundational part of this whole knowledge ecosystem, are you optimistic about the revival of the whole situation, or what do you feel?
One thing that is good that has happened is 90s was particularly bad. 90s, we saw that there was physical threat to journalists. There was threat from militants, there was threat from security forces, there was threat from counterinsurgents, there was threat because there were too many militant groups and one was warring with the other. And their entire problem used to be, you've given them 10 centimeters, you've given me 4 centimeters of space. And that would invite bans, that would invite intimidations, beating of staffers. And if the army versions were not carried, or CRPF versions and all, and then similar kind of backlash from those as well. So that period still, journalists kept fighting. But somewhere, I think it didn't grow beyond a point. Journalism didn't grow. It wasn't maturing. It was just sustaining itself for the first one decade. Um, After the 90s, 2000 onwards, many younger people joined in, and new media organizations came up, new newspapers, magazines, fortnightlies in Kashmir Valley, and immense talent. And
Mm.
there is a great breed of immensely talented youngsters. They're very committed, they are very brave and courageous as well. And the way they articulate themselves, the way they know how to query information, I think extremely brilliant, and that is what gives me hope.
Yeah. Ma'am, this is the final question from my part, and this I feel is the question which you'll be able to answer the most uh, perfect way. How do you analyze the implication of this intimidation of journalists, which happens by both institutional and non-institutional measures? For example, non-institutional would include killing of journalists, or from institutional methods, we can say what happened with Masrat Zahra, with UAPA being charged against her. Is this approach radically changing the discourse of journalism, specifically in Kashmir region?
Now it's the intimidation is more faceless, that time. I mean, it was faceless in another way, but their presence was very formidable. The presence of the gun, the threat of the gun, and they could just appear anywhere and any time. Right now it's like, as a senior colleague rightly put it, he said that this is undeclared censorship.
Hmm.
It's very sophisticated. You choke the finances. You get some the editors to play to your tune. Their errant reporters can be sent marching, or can be fine tuned by scaling down their salaries or whatever, which is what that I keep hearing of is happening. And you don't announce censorship rules, but you take away the tools of the journalists. I mean, say for instance, all these communication systems, without which today's journalism cannot sustain.
Hmm.
So that I think that is it's a new kind of a challenge, and we're trying to negotiate, trying to find a way out. And I'm not the only one. I think many others are struggling as well.
Ma'am, will you be able to answer a few of the questions which the audience has raised? Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the first question is poverty, unemployment, and illiteracy continue to be a bitter face of our nation. How can the issue of digital divide be addressed?
It is a very relevant question, and because when we're talking about, and I'm talking about digital freedom, and when I say that, I think somewhere I'm wrong also, because I'm not addressing the poor and the unemployed and the illiterate people of the country. But what I can talk about from my own experience, I think there is need for this digital divide to be addressed, and where the state does need to play a role. It's not just sloganeering of digital India that is going to help. You need to help people to be better connected. But what I can talk about is in my own state, because of its very difficult topography. You have plains here where I'm living, the best of the area, and you have the valley, the Kashmir Valley, but you also have the hilly areas. You also have Ladakh, if I still include it as part of at least the erstwhile state. Um, and there used to be a time in the 90s. I'm
Hmm.
talking about as a news person in the 90s, there were things happening in these areas. I mean, not just like Rajouri Punch, for instance, or Kupwara and all these. Kupwara was still better connected to Srinagar because of the distance. Rajouri Punch is very far away. To go to Punch, it takes about 8 hours by road. So, and these are border areas. These were always hot. There's something happening there. Then militancy came along, and these regions got impacted. There was Doda and Chenab Valley, which was also badly impacted. And we never used to get any information from these areas, except from the major towns where we had stringers or reporters. working, and the only means of sending news was through the phone. So he would dictate it on the phone and we would, take it down. And any kind of news that had a longer shelf life would be sent in packets, which would reach us 2 days later or 3 days later. What the mobile phone did, the smartphone did, is to connect people in these areas, not just in those towns, the main headquarters in these hill districts, but also small villages. So, people were able to connect on to each other, to connect on the social media, and they also had access to their political representatives through these smartphones. They had access to media, and we had access to them. We had much more voices um, in the media at that.
Okay. Uh, now, there's one more question by Ram, which says, according to you, what are the possible solutions for Kashmir issue? This is limited to the issue of internet shutdown.
I mean, possibly this would take another session on just the possible solutions, but any solution has to include the peoples of Jammu and Kashmir. And when I may say Jammu and Kashmir, it's the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir. And Jammu and Kashmir, it's extremely complex because there are diverse aspirations. There are people of Ladakh, and within Ladakh, they're divided between Leh and Kargil. Kashmir is one of the most homogeneous of the regions. Then we have Jammu, where we have it's multi ethnic, it's multilingual. There are different religions as well. So there are different aspirations in different regions. There is also Jammu and Kashmir on the other side, which again stands divided between the what we call as Pak administered Kashmir and the Gilgit Baltistan, which so it's an extremely complex region. But any solution has to involve the people. It has to be in accordance with the people's wishes. I mean, there can be negotiations, there can be compromises, and which is how peace in any conflict regions are achieved. If you look at the world conflicts across the world which have been resolved peacefully, this is how things have worked. And there's always been a little give and take, but at least people have had that, where people have had that feeling of being involved, even if they don't get much at the end of the day. But just that feeling of being involved, of having participated, is extremely empowering. And it gives the people confidence in uh, the other stakeholders, the powerful stakeholders.
Ma'am, we'll take the final question now. And the next question is regarding the idea of digital dignity, which the government has to ensure. Do you feel that the government of India has a responsibility to ensure digital dignity of citizens by uh, by putting people in a prolonged phase of darkness? It is also infringing upon these basic essential values which a person has in this digital era.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more. So yes, um, I mean, any kind of, because your smartphone itself, as I mentioned, it's not just in those rural areas back of beyond villages I'm talking about. It gives you a sense of empowerment. It gives you a voice, it gives you your vocation, it gives you your knowledge, your information, your ability to say something on your own. Today an individual does not need just the media. It can use on its own. It can, an individual can launch his her own blog, can use the social media. Of course there are pitfalls, because the social media again is also being used to spew a lot of venom and hatred. But despite all of that, it's important for people to have the freedom to express themselves, to have that the digital access, which will provide. I completely agree on this concept of digital dignity, and this needs to be promoted. And along with that, that digital divide, because when we're talking about dignity, then why should only 20 or 30% of the population have access to that dignified living? Why not 100%?
Okay, ma'am. So we'll wind up because I feel all the other questions you have answered in one of our discussion. Ma'am, it was a great pleasure having a conversation with you. I hope even the audience would have gained a new perspective after listening to the ground realities. We are extremely thankful for joining with us today, and we are more thankful for your initiatives and the kind of work which you do. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much.